Number 8. The men eaten alive by the Cyclops. Everyone knows the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops. Almost nobody remembers what that Cyclops did to his men before Odysseus ever touched him. When Odysseus and 12 of his best sailors wandered into a massive cave on an unfamiliar island, they found cheese, milk, and pens full of sheep, and decided to wait for the owner to come home, hoping for a guest gift, the kind of hospitality every Greek traveler was owed by law and by the gods. What came home instead was Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant the size of a small mountain, son of the sea god Poseidon himself. He sealed the cave entrance with a boulder so massive that no 10 men alive could have moved it, trapping Odysseus and his crew inside with him. When he noticed the strangers, he didn't offer them food. He reached down, grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men by the ankles, and smashed their skulls against the cave floor like a man cracking eggs. Then he ate them, all of them, bones included. His men watched it happen a few feet away, unable to do anything but wait their turn. The next morning, before heading out with his flock, Polyphemus grabbed 2 more men and ate them for breakfast, just as casually as the night before. Odysseus realized that if he didn't act, his entire crew would be gone within days, eaten 2 at a time like livestock being rationed. So he offered the giant strong wine, let him drink himself into a stupor, and told him his name was Nobody. While Polyphemus slept off the wine, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a sharpened, fire-hardened stake directly into his single eye, blinding him completely. Polyphemus screamed in agony, and when the other Cyclopes outside asked who was hurting him, he shouted back that nobody was hurting him, and they simply walked away, assuming he was fine. The next morning, blind and desperate, Polyphemus felt the backs of his sheep as they left the cave, checking for escaping men. He never thought to check underneath them. Odysseus's surviving crew escaped tied to the bellies of the giant's own flock. It should have ended there. But sailing away to safety, Odysseus couldn't resist one final act of pride. He turned back and shouted his real name across the water, making sure the monster knew exactly who had beaten him. Polyphemus begged his father Poseidon to curse that name forever. Poseidon listened, and the sea god's rage would follow Odysseus for the next 10 years. A curse that started with 2 men crushed like eggshells in a dark cave and wouldn't finish collecting its debt until 7 more names on this list were already dead. Number 7. Elpenor, the man nobody remembers falling. Not every death in the Odyssey involves a monster. Some of them are almost embarrassingly human, which somehow makes them worse. Elpenor was the youngest man on Odysseus's ship, not the strongest, not the smartest, barely mentioned before the night that killed him. The crew had spent an entire year on the island of the witch goddess Circe, who had turned half of them into pigs before eventually welcoming them as guests. On their final night before finally continuing the journey home, there was a farewell feast, and Elpenor drank far more wine than his body could handle. Too drunk to think clearly and craving fresh air, he climbed up onto the flat roof of Circe's house to sleep it off under the open sky. When the crew was called at dawn to load the ship and leave, Elpenor woke up disoriented, forgot entirely that he wasn't on solid ground, and instead of taking the stairs, stepped straight off the edge of the roof. He fell, snapped his neck on the way down, and died instantly on the ground below, before anyone even realized he was gone. Odysseus didn't notice he was missing until they had already set sail. The next stop on the journey was the entrance to the underworld itself, where Odysseus needed to speak with the dead to learn how to get home. Of every soul waiting in that dark, endless crowd, heroes, kings, his own mother among them, the very first ghost to approach him was Elpenor, still confused, still barely believing he was dead, begging Odysseus for one thing, a proper burial and a marker on his grave, so his soul wouldn't wander forever unburied and forgotten. Odysseus promised he would return, and he kept that promise, sailing back to the island he'd just left, burning Elpenor's body on the shore and planting his oar upright in the burial mound as a marker, the single, quiet death in the entire epic that happens not to a monster, not in battle, but to a drunk young man who simply forgot where the edge of a roof was. It's easy to laugh at how ordinary it sounds next to everything else on this list. It's a lot harder to laugh once you remember that of every soul waiting in that endless crowd of the dead, the very first one to reach Odysseus wasn't a monster's victim at all. It was the man his own crew almost forgot to count. Number 6. The fleet torn apart by giant cannibals. If the Cyclops was terrifying, the Laestrygonians were something closer to an extinction event. Odysseus commanded 12 ships when he left Troy. After this one afternoon, he commanded exactly one. The fleet sailed into what looked like the perfect harbor. Narrow, sheltered, calm water protected on all sides by steep cliffs, the kind of natural fortress any sailor would be relieved to find after a long voyage. Odysseus, cautious by nature after everything he'd already survived, anchored his own ship just outside the harbor entrance instead of sailing all the way in. The rest of his fleet, 11 ships in total, sailed confidently into the enclosed bay and tied up along the shore. That caution is the only reason Odysseus is remembered at all. The Laestrygonians weren't ordinary raiders. They were giants, cannibal giants, and the harbor wasn't shelter, it was a trap shaped like one. The moment the 11 ships were tied up and trapped inside the narrow inlet with no room to turn or flee, the giants appeared on the cliffs above and began hurling boulders down onto the ships below, splintering hulls, crushing men where they stood on deck. Sailors who dove into the water to escape didn't fare any better. The giants speared them out of the sea one by one, the way a fisherman spears fish from a riverbank, and carried the bodies away to eat. In a matter of minutes, 11 fully crewed ships and every single man aboard them were gone. Hundreds of sailors who had survived 9 years of the Trojan War and the Cyclops' cave, wiped out in an afternoon by monsters they never even had a chance to fight. Odysseus, watching from just outside the harbor, cut his own ship's mooring line and rowed away as fast as his remaining men could pull, leaving the wreckage and the screaming behind. He arrived at his next destination with a single ship and a crew that now understood, in the most brutal way possible, that surviving Troy had bought them nothing. 10 years of siege warfare, 10 years of Achilles and Hector and every horror the war could throw at them, and none of it had prepared a single one of those men for a harbor that turned out to be a killing flaw. The survivors who made it out with Odysseus didn't celebrate. They rowed in complete silence, because there was nothing left on that ship to say. Number 5, the 6 men Scylla took one by one. Circe warned Odysseus exactly what was waiting in the strait ahead. A narrow passage with 2 horrors on either side, close enough that a ship couldn't avoid both. On one side, Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed the sea itself 3 times a day, capable of dragging an entire ship and everything aboard it straight down to destruction. On the other side, Scylla, a 6-headed monster living inside a cliffside cave, each of her 6 long necks ending in a mouth full of razor teeth, each head capable of snatching a man clean off a ship's deck without the vessel even slowing down. Circe's advice was blunt and, in its own way, monstrous. Steer closer to Scylla. Losing 6 men one at a time was a survivable loss. Losing the entire ship to Charybdis was not. Odysseus made the calculation his crew never got to vote on and steered toward the cliff, choosing exactly which kind of horror his men would face without telling most of them why. As the ship passed beneath the cave, 6 long necks shot down at once, each one seizing a different sailor by the waist and hoisting him screaming into the air. Odysseus, weapon in hand, watched it happen and did nothing, because Circe had warned him that fighting back would only slow the ship down long enough for Scylla to take more. He describes it afterward as the single most painful thing he witnessed in his entire 10-year journey. 6 of his own men who had survived the Cyclops, survived the Laestrygonians, survived 9 years of war, reaching their arms out toward him and screaming his name as they were carried up into the cave to be eaten alive, while the rest of the crew could only keep rowing, unable to look away and unable to help. Odysseus would go on to survive the Trojan War, a Cyclops, and a shipwreck that killed his entire fleet. He never fully got over that particular 6 minutes, and he says so himself. Number 4. The crew Zeus killed with a single bolt of lightning. By the time Odysseus reached the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of the sun, god Helios, his crew had been starving, grieving, and terrified for weeks. Odysseus had been warned twice, once by the blind prophet Tiresias in the underworld, and once again by Circe. Land on that island if you must, but under no circumstances touch the sacred cattle, or none of you will make it home. He told his men exactly that the moment they landed. For days, they kept the promise, living off dwindling rations while herds of golden cattle grazed peacefully nearby. Then the wind turned against them, trapping the ship on the island for an entire month, and the food ran out completely. One afternoon while Odysseus was inland praying, his men, starving, desperate, convinced they were going to die anyway, slaughtered several of the sacred cattle and ate them, promising the gods elaborate future sacrifices to make up for it. Odysseus returned to find it already done, the smell of roasting meat filling the air, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the punishment they all knew was coming. Helios was furious and went straight to Zeus with an ultimatum: "Punish these men, or I will take the sun itself down to the underworld and shine there instead, leaving the world in permanent darkness." Zeus agreed immediately. As soon as the crew finally set sail again, a sudden storm appeared out of nowhere, and Zeus hurled a single thunderbolt directly into the ship, splitting it apart at the mast and killing every single man aboard except Odysseus, who was thrown clear into the water. He clung to broken wreckage. Literally, the same mast and keel lashed together with a single rope and drifted alone for 9 days with no crew, no ship, and no food, before finally washing ashore on the island of the nymph Calypso, now completely alone for the very first time in a journey that had started with over 600 men under his command. Everyone who had sailed with him out of Troy, every man who had survived the Cyclops, the cannibal giants, and the 6 heads of Scylla, was gone in the space of a single afternoon, over one broken promise and one desperate meal. Number 3. Antinous, the first suitor to die. 20 years after Odysseus left for Troy, his palace on Ithaca had been overrun by over 100 suitors, men who assumed he was dead and had moved into his home uninvited, feasting on his livestock, drinking his wine, and pressuring his wife Penelope to remarry one of them. Of all of them, Antinous was the worst, the loudest, the cruelest, the one who openly mocked beggars, insulted Odysseus's own son Telemachus to his face, and had already secretly plotted to have Telemachus murdered before he could inherit the throne. When the disguised Odysseus, dressed as a filthy old beggar nobody recognized, finally revealed himself in the middle of the great hall with a bow none of the suitors had even been able to string, Antinous was the very first man he aimed at. He was mid-drink, lifting a golden cup of wine to his lips, completely unaware that the ragged old man across the hall was the king he'd spent years mocking and robbing. The arrow struck him clean through the throat. The cup fell from his hand, wine and blood spilling together across the table as he collapsed backward, kicking the table over, food and dishes crashing to the floor around him. For one full frozen moment, the rest of the suitors thought it had to be an accident, a beggar's wild shot gone wrong. Then Odysseus stood up straight, threw off his rags, and told them exactly who he was, and the moment of confusion turned into pure panic, because they suddenly understood that the doors were barred, their own weapons were locked away in another room, and the man standing in front of them with a fully drawn bow had just spent 20 years surviving cyclopes, cannibal giants, and sea monsters, and he had walked into this hall with nothing left to lose. 20 years of monsters, storms, and dead friends had a way of stripping the fear out of a man, and the suitors, drunk on wine and years of stolen comfort, were about to find that out one arrow at a time. Number 2. Eurymachus and the slaughter of 100 men. If Antinous was the suitors' cruelty, Eurymachus was their cowardice, and it didn't save him for even a minute. The moment Antinous hit the floor, Eurymachus tried to talk his way out of what was coming, insisting loudly that Antinous alone had planned every crime against the household, that the rest of them were innocent, that they'd gladly pay back everything they'd eaten and stolen if Odysseus would just spare them. Odysseus didn't answer with words. Eurymachus drew his own sword in a final act of desperation and charged, and was cut down before he'd taken 3 steps, an arrow finding him just as precisely as the one that had killed Antinous moments earlier. What followed wasn't a duel, or even really a battle. It was closer to a massacre. Over 100 suitors were trapped in that hall with the doors barred, most of them unarmed because their own weapons had been quietly moved to a locked storeroom days earlier on Odysseus's orders. Odysseus, his son Telemachus, and 2 loyal servants, the swineherd Eumaeus and the cowherd Philoetius, cut down suitor after suitor with arrows and spears, some men trying to flee, some trying to fight back with bare hands or overturned furniture, none of it enough. The goddess Athena herself is described appearing in the hall in disguise to make sure none of the arrows missed. By the time it ended, the marble floor of Odysseus's own home was, in Homer's own brutal description, slick with blood and bodies stacked, like fish hauled up on shore to die gasping in the sun. Every single suitor who had spent years eating Odysseus's food and courting his wife was dead in the same room, in the same hour, and the silence afterward was almost worse than the noise before it. Number 1. The 12 maids left hanging, and the man left in pieces. This is the ending most retellings quietly leave out, and it might be the darkest single passage in the entire epic. Once the suitors were dead, Odysseus discovered something that made him even angrier. 12 of the household's own maidservants had slept with the suitors during his absence, and in his eyes, in Telemachus's eyes, that made them traitors as much as the suitors themselves. The punishment came in 2 parts. First, the 12 women were forced to carry the suitors' corpses out of the hall with their own hands and scrub the blood-soaked floor clean, made to clean up the exact horror they were about to be executed for. Then Telemachus, on his father's instruction, strung a single length of ship's rope across the courtyard, tied nooses along its length, and hanged all 12 women together at once. Homer describes their feet twitching, for a little while, but not for long, comparing it directly to birds caught in a snare, their wings still fluttering after the trap has already done its work. It's one of the coldest images in the entire poem, and it still wasn't the worst punishment handed out that day. Melanthius, the palace goatherd who had sided with the suitors, insulted Odysseus to his face while he was still disguised as a beggar, and even armed the suitors with weapons during the fighting, was dragged out separately and mutilated while still alive, his nose and ears cut off, his hands and feet severed, and, in Homer's own words, his genitals cut off and thrown to the dogs to eat while he was still breathing. He was left to die from his wounds afterward, alone in the courtyard. Even by the standards of an epic already full of monsters and massacres, ancient audiences and modern scholars alike have argued for centuries over this single passage, whether it was meant as righteous justice against traitors, or whether even Homer knew he'd written something that crossed a line no monster in the entire story had. Notice something about this final death, the darkest one on the whole list. For the first time in 8 entries, the danger wasn't a cyclops, a giant, a 6-headed horror, or an angry god. It was Odysseus himself, standing in his own home, deciding exactly how far justice was allowed to go, and going further than that anyway. 8 deaths. Not one of them happened in the war everyone remembers. The Trojan War made Odysseus famous. Getting home almost killed everyone who ever sailed with him, and it ended with a hallway of corpses in his own front room. That's the part the word Odyssey quietly hides every time someone uses it to describe a long, difficult journey. The original Odyssey wasn't just long. It had one of the highest body counts in all of Greek mythology, and almost none of the victims got a monster's death. Most of them died to hunger, to pride, to a single bad decision on a single bad night. So here's the real question. Out of these 8, which death do you think you would have survived? And which one do you think you wouldn't have seen coming at all? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want the next video to go back even further, before the Odyssey, before Troy, to the heroes who never even made it to the war, hit subscribe, because that one's already being written.